On January 18, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the very heart of French royal glory, the monument to French greatness, the building that had symbolized French dominance over Europe for 2 centuries, German princes gathered to proclaim their king as Kaiser of a new German empire. The French weren't invited. They weren't even consulted. They were simply humiliated. While this ceremony was taking place, Paris was starving. The greatest city in Europe had been under siege for 4 months. Parisians were eating rats, horses, and the animals from the zoo. The elephants Castor and Pollux had been slaughtered and sold as exotic meat to wealthy citizens who could afford such delicacies during the famine. Dogs and cats had disappeared from the streets. People were dying of hunger and cold in a city that had considered itself the center of civilization. The French Emperor Napoleon, the third nephew of the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte, had already surrendered. He had been captured on a battlefield 6 months earlier, handed over his sword, and been shipped off to comfortable imprisonment in Germany. His empire had collapsed in a single afternoon. The nation that had dominated European politics for centuries, that had conquered most of the continent under the first Napoleon, that had considered itself the greatest military power on earth, had been utterly and completely crushed in less than 6 weeks of actual fighting. And now the Germans were rubbing salt in the wound. They could have proclaimed their empire anywhere, Berlin, Frankfurt, any German city would have done, but they chose Versailles. They chose to birth their nation in France's most sacred space, surrounded by paintings celebrating French military victories, beneath ceilings glorifying French kings. It was deliberate. It was calculated, and it would poison European politics for the next 75 years. The Franco-Prussian War lasted barely 10 months, but its consequences shaped the 20th century. It created the German Empire, the nation that would launch to world wars. It planted the seeds of French revanchism, the burning desire for revenge that would make France eager for a rematch in 1914. It shifted the balance of power in Europe so dramatically that the entire diplomatic order had to be rebuilt from scratch. And it all started because of a telegram that was edited to be more insulting than it actually was. This is the story of how Otto von Bismarck, the most cunning statesman of the 19th century, manipulated a great nation into a war it couldn't win, and how that war created a monster that would eventually consume Europe. To understand the Franco-Prussian War, you need to understand Bismarck. And to understand Bismarck, you need to understand what Germany was and wasn't in 1870. When most people think of Germany today, they think of a single unified nation. But for most of history, there was no such thing. What we now call Germany was, for centuries, a patchwork of hundreds of independent states. Principalities, duchies, kingdoms, and city-states, loosely organized under the theoretical authority of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire famously noted, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Napoleon Bonaparte had swept away this medieval mess, consolidating the German states and reorganizing them under French influence. After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna created the German Confederation, a loose alliance of 39 states dominated by Austria, the largest and most powerful of the German-speaking lands. But the 19th century was the age of nationalism, and Germans increasingly dreamed of unification. They wanted what the French and British already had, a single nation-state that could project power and command respect on the world stage. The question was, who would lead this united Germany? The answer came down to 2 rivals, Austria and Prussia. Austria was the traditional leader of the German world, but it was a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire that included Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, and dozens of other nationalities. Many German nationalists wanted a Kleindeutschland, a smaller Germany that excluded Austria and its non-German populations. Prussia was the alternative. It was militaristic, efficient, Protestant, and aggressively ambitious. It had the best army in Europe and a tradition of punching above its weight. And in 1862, it acquired a minister-president who would transform European history, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was not a likable man. He was arrogant, ruthless, and utterly convinced of his own genius, which, to be fair, he actually possessed. He had contempt for public opinion, for parliamentary democracy, and for anyone who stood in his way. He believed that the great questions of the age would be decided not by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. He was also a political artist of the highest order. While other statesmen reacted to events, Bismarck created them. He didn't wait for opportunities, he manufactured them. And his masterpiece was the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. Bismarck's method was simple in concept, though fiendishly complex in execution. He would fight a series of carefully limited wars, each designed to isolate and defeat a single opponent while keeping other powers neutral. Each victory would bring more German states under Prussian influence. Eventually, German unification would seem not like Prussian conquest, but like the natural fulfillment of German national destiny. The first war, in 1864, was against Denmark over the disputed duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Prussia fought alongside Austria, and the two powers easily defeated the Danes. The division of the spoils, however, was deliberately designed by Bismarck to create friction with Austria. The Second War, in 1866, was against Austria itself. Bismarck provoked a conflict over the administration of the conquered duchies, isolated Austria diplomatically, and then crushed the Austrian army at the Battle of Königgrätz in just 7 weeks. Austria was expelled from German affairs forever. The North German Confederation, dominated by Prussia, emerged from the war as the nucleus of a future united Germany. But the German states south of the main river Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and others remained outside Prussian control. They were Catholic, suspicious of Protestant Prussia, and traditionally aligned with France. Bismarck needed something to bring them into the fold. He needed a common enemy. He needed France. France in 1870 was ruled by Napoleon III, one of the strangest figures ever to lead a major European power. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was the nephew of the great Napoleon, son of the emperor's brother. After his uncle's defeat at Waterloo, Louis Napoleon had grown up in exile, dreaming of restoring the Bonaparte dynasty. He attempted to coups against the French monarchy, both of which failed spectacularly. The first resulted in deportation, the second in imprisonment. He escaped from prison disguised as a workman and fled to England. But the revolutions of 1848 changed everything. France overthrew its king and established a republic. Louis Napoleon returned, ran for president, and won in a landslide largely on the strength of his name. In 1851, when his term was about to expire and the Constitution prevented him from running again, he simply staged a coup, dissolved the legislature, and made himself dictator. A year later, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. It sounds almost comical, but Napoleon III was no fool. For nearly 2 decades, he had ruled France with a combination of authoritarian control and genuine popular support. He modernized Paris, rebuilt the French economy, and pursued an aggressive foreign policy designed to restore French glory. He fought wars in Crimea, Italy, and Mexico with mixed results, but he had generally kept France at the center of European affairs. By 1870, however, Napoleon III was in trouble. His health was failing. He suffered from kidney stones so severe that he sometimes couldn't sit on a horse. His Mexican adventure had ended in disaster, with the French puppet Emperor Maximilian executed by firing squad. Liberal opposition was growing at home. He desperately needed a foreign policy success to shore up his regime. Bismarck was about to give him the opposite. The immediate cause of the Franco-Prussian War was a crisis over the Spanish throne, one of those absurd dynastic tangles that 19th century Europe specialized in producing. Spain had been without a stable monarch since Queen Isabella II was overthrown in 1868. The Spanish government offered the crown to various European princes, all of whom declined for one reason or another. Finally, in 1870, they approached Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, a distant relative of the Prussian king, Wilhelm I. Leopold was initially reluctant, but Bismarck saw an opportunity and pushed hard for him to accept. A Hohenzollern prince on the Spanish throne would extend Prussian influence to France's southern border. France would feel encircled a Hohenzollern to the east in Berlin and another to the southwest in Madrid. When the news leaked in July 1870, France exploded with outrage. The French foreign minister declared that France would not tolerate a Hohenzollern on the Spanish throne. The French press screamed about Prussian encirclement. Napoleon III, under pressure from his hawkish advisors and his even more hawkish Empress, Eugenie, demanded that Leopold's candidacy be withdrawn. To almost everyone's surprise, Prussia backed down. King Wilhelm I, who had never been enthusiastic about the Spanish adventure, pressured Leopold's father to withdraw the candidacy. The crisis appeared to be over, but the French weren't satisfied. They wanted more. They wanted humiliation. The French ambassador, Count Vincent Benedetti, was instructed to extract a promise from King Wilhelm that no Hohenzollern would ever again be a candidate for the Spanish throne. This was an extraordinary demand, essentially requiring the Prussian king to humiliate himself by guaranteeing future good behavior. Benedetti met Wilhelm at the German spa town of Bad Ems on July 13, 1870. The conversation was polite, but unproductive. Wilhelm refused to make any binding commitment about the future, but assured Benedetti that he considered the matter closed. He declined a second meeting, sending word through an aide that he had nothing further to add. It was a diplomatic non-event. Wilhelm had been courteous, Benedetti had been persistent, and nothing had really happened. Then Bismarck got involved. The king's aide, Heinrich Abeken, sent Bismarck a telegram describing the encounter. Bismarck was dining with the chief of the Prussian General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, and the war minister, Albrecht von Roon. When he read the telegram, Bismarck saw his opportunity. He took out his pen and edited the telegram. He didn't fabricate anything, he simply shortened it, removing the context and courtesies, making it sound as though Wilhelm had brusquely dismissed the French ambassador. The edited version implied that the king had insulted Benedetti and that Benedetti had made outrageous demands. Bismarck then released this edited Ems dispatch to the press. The effect was electric. In Germany, the telegram read like a French insult to the Prussian king. In France, it read like a Prussian insult to the French ambassador. Both nations were outraged at the other's behavior. Crowds in Berlin and Paris demanded war. Moltke, reading the edited telegram, understood immediately what Bismarck had done. Now it has a different ring, he said. Before, it sounded like a parley. Now it is like a flourish in answer to a challenge. Bismarck smiled. If I communicate this text to the newspapers, he said, it will be known in Paris before midnight, and not only on account of its contents, but also on account of the manner of its distribution. It will have the effect of a red rag upon the Gallic bull. He was right. On July 19, 1870, France declared war on Prussia. Napoleon III and his advisors were supremely confident. The French army was considered the finest in Europe, heir to the traditions of the great Napoleon. French soldiers had conquered Algeria, fought in the Crimea, defeated the Austrians in Italy. They had the Chassepot rifle, a breech-loading weapon far superior to the Prussian needle gun. They had the mitrailleurs, an early machine gun that could fire 150 rounds per minute. We are ready, declared the French war minister, Marshal Edmond Leboeuf. So ready that if the war lasts 2 years, not a button will be missing from our soldiers' gaiters. It was one of the most spectacularly wrong predictions in military history. The French army of 1870 looked magnificent on paper and was catastrophically dysfunctional in reality. There was no general staff worth the name. Planning was haphazard and coordination was non-existent. Mobilization was chaotic. Reservists couldn't find their units couldn't find their equipment, and nobody seemed to know where anything was supposed to go. The French had the better rifle, but the Prussians had the better artillery. Krupp's steel breech-loading cannon could fire faster and more accurately than the French bronze muzzle-loaders. And while the French had the mitrailleurs, they didn't know how to use it. They deployed it like artillery, far behind the lines, instead of using it as the infantry weapon it should have been. Most critically, the French had no Moltke. Helmuth von Moltke the Elder was, alongside Bismarck, the architect of Prussian success. While Bismarck handled diplomacy, Moltke handled war, and he had revolutionized how war was waged. Moltke understood that the railroad and the telegraph had transformed military operations. Wars would now be won not by the army that fought best, but by the army that mobilized fastest, concentrated most efficiently, and coordinated most effectively. He had spent years developing detailed mobilization plans, working out exactly which units would travel on which trains to which assembly points. Every contingency was anticipated. Every timetable was calculated to the hour. The Prussian army that mobilized in July 1870 was the most efficiently organized military force the world had ever seen. Within 18 days, 380,000 soldiers were concentrated on the French border, ready to fight. The French, by contrast, were still sorting out the chaos of their mobilization. Moltke's strategy was simple. Don't wait for the French to attack. Attack first, strike hard, and destroy the enemy army in a decisive battle. The Prussians wouldn't aim for territory, they would aim for annihilation. 3 German armies crossed into France in early August. The first clashes were small-scale, confused affairs as advance units bumped into each other. But they established a pattern that would hold throughout the war: Prussian artillery dominance, Prussian tactical coordination, and French courage squandered through poor leadership. At Wissembourg on August 4th, a Prussian corps overwhelmed an isolated French division. At Spitzscheren and Worth on August 6th, larger battles produced the same result: French troops fighting bravely but being outmaneuvered and outgunned at every turn. The French army, which had expected to carry the war into German territory, found itself retreating after less than a week of fighting. Napoleon III, who had taken personal command despite his agonizing kidney stones, was losing control of the situation. The French armies were operating in the field, but they were failing to coordinate. One, under Marshal Bazaine, was concentrating around the fortress city of Metz. The other, nominally under Napoleon III, but effectively led by Marshal Montcalm, was retreating toward Chalons. Moltke saw his opportunity. If he could trap Bazaine's army at Metz, he could then turn and destroy MacMahon's force at leisure. The war could be over in weeks. The Battle of Gravelotte-Saint-Privat on August 18, 1870, was the largest battle of the war and one of the bloodiest of the 19th century. Nearly 200,000 Germans attacked 113,000 French defenders in fortified positions west of Metz. The French fought magnificently. Their chassepot rifles mowed down Prussian infantry at ranges where the Prussian needle gun couldn't respond. The Prussian Guard, the elite of the elite, was shattered attacking the village of Saint-Privat, losing over 8,000 men. In 20 minutes, the worst casualties suffered by any Prussian unit in the entire war. But the Prussians won anyway. Their artillery hammered the French positions. Their numbers told. By nightfall, Bazaine had retreated into Metz, where his army of 180,000 men was now trapped. The largest French field army had been bottled up in a fortress, unable to influence the rest of the campaign. It was a strategic catastrophe from which France would not recover. Napoleon III, desperate to rescue Bazaine, ordered Montcalm to march toward Metz. It was exactly what Moltke wanted. Instead of retreating to Paris and defending the capital, the French were marching into a trap. The Germans swung north, cutting across MacMahon's line of march. By late August, they had maneuvered the French into a pocket around the small town of Sedan, near the Belgian border. MacMahon's army and Napoleon III himself was surrounded. The town of Sedan sits in a loop of the Meuse River, surrounded by wooded hills that rise steeply on all sides. In peacetime, it was a quiet fortress town, unremarkable except for its textile factories. On September 1, 1870, it became the site of the greatest military disaster in French history. Marshal MacMahon had approximately 120,000 men trapped in and around Sedan. The German armies, over 200,000 strong, occupied the heights surrounding the town, their artillery positioned to rain fire down on the French from every direction. Escape was impossible. The Belgians had closed their border and would intern any French troops who crossed it. The only roads out led directly into German lines. MacMahon himself was wounded early on the first day of battle, hit by a shell fragment that shattered his hip. Command passed first to General Ducret, then to General Wimpfen, who had arrived just the day before with orders from Paris appointing him second in command. Wimpfen had no knowledge of the situation, no rapport with the troops, and no realistic plan for breaking out. What he had was courage, and courage without competence is just a recipe for higher casualties. The French soldiers fought with desperate valor throughout September 1st. Cavalry charged artillery batteries. Infantry defended positions until they were overwhelmed. The famous charges of Sedan saw French horsemen hurl themselves against Prussian guns in a display of suicidal bravery that accomplished nothing except to add to the body count. General Auguste Alexandre Ducret, watching the hopeless situation unfold, reportedly declared, "We are in the chamber pot and we shall be shat upon." It was crude, but it was accurate. By afternoon, German artillery had turned Sedan into a killing ground. Shells crashed into the packed streets, into the hospitals, into the crowds of soldiers who had nowhere to go. Fires broke out throughout the town. The wounded lay in the open, screaming for help that never came. The dead piled up faster than they could be removed. Napoleon III, watching from a small hill near Sedan, was in agony both from his kidney stones and from the spectacle before him. He had come to the front hoping to die gloriously in battle, perhaps to salvage something of his reputation through a heroic death. Instead, he found himself presiding over the destruction of his army and his empire. As evening approached, Napoleon did the only thing left to him. He ordered a white flag raised over Sedan and sent a message to the Prussian king. "Not having been able to die at the head of my troops, there is nothing left for me but to surrender my sword to your majesty." The surrender negotiations took place the next morning, September 2nd, in a small weaver's cottage near the village of Donchery. Napoleon III, looking old and ill, met with Bismarck in a room so cramped that they could barely move. Bismarck was not interested in generosity. He demanded the surrender of the entire French army, at Sedan over 100,000 men as prisoners of war. Napoleon protested that he had surrendered his own person, not the army. Wimpfen, who still harbored fantasies of breaking out, tried to negotiate better terms. Bismarck refused. The French could surrender unconditionally, or the bombardment would resume. They surrendered. The statistics of Sedan were staggering. The French lost approximately 17,000 killed and wounded, plus another 21,000 captured during the battle itself. The surrender added 83,000 more prisoners, including 2,800 officers and 39 generals. The Germans captured 558 artillery pieces and over 66,000 rifles. An entire army had ceased to exist in a single day. Among the prisoners was Napoleon III himself, the first French sovereign to be captured by a foreign enemy since King John II was taken by the English at Poitiers in 1356, over 500 years earlier. The Second French Empire, which had ruled France for 18 years, collapsed that afternoon. When news of Sedan reached Paris on September 4th, crowds stormed the Legislative Assembly and demanded a republic. The Empress Eugenie fled to England. A provisional government of national defense was proclaimed, led by General Louis-Jules Trochu as president and Leon Gambetta as the driving force. The war, everyone assumed, was over. Napoleon had surrendered. The French army had been destroyed. Surely the new government would negotiate peace, but the French refused to give up. The government of national defense faced an impossible situation and chose to make it worse by refusing to accept any peace terms that included territorial concessions. Bismarck demanded Alsace and part of Lorraine, French provinces with significant German-speaking populations. To French patriots, this was unthinkable. These were French lands, French citizens, French soil that had been part of France for centuries. No legitimate French government could simply hand them over to satisfy Prussian greed. Not an inch of our territory, not a stone of our fortresses, declared Jules Favre, the foreign minister of the new government. It was a noble sentiment. It was also suicidal. The French professional army was gone dead, captured, or besieged at Metz, where Bazaine's 180,000 men were still trapped and slowly starving. The new government had enthusiasm and patriotic fervor, but it had almost no trained soldiers. What it did have was Paris. Paris in 1870 was a fortress. The city was surrounded by a massive wall, punctuated by 16 major forts and dozens of smaller positions. It had a garrison of over 400,000 men, mostly National Guards, raw recruits, and hastily organized volunteers, but enough to make any assault extremely costly. The city had stockpiled food and ammunition for a siege. The government calculated that if Paris could hold out long enough, something would change. Perhaps the neutral powers would intervene. Perhaps revolutionary movements would erupt across Europe. Perhaps the Germans would simply exhaust themselves. It was magical thinking, but it was the only hope left. On September 19th, German forces completed their encirclement of Paris. The siege had begun. The siege of Paris lasted 135 days over 4 months of bombardment, starvation, and futile resistance. It was one of the most dramatic sieges in modern history, and it revealed both the heroism and the hopelessness of the French situation. The 2 million people trapped in Paris included not just soldiers but the entire civilian population: men, women, children, the elderly, the sick. As the siege dragged on, food became increasingly scarce. First, the luxuries disappeared, then the staples. The price of bread skyrocketed. The price of meat became astronomical when meat could be found in all. Parisians ate things that would have been unthinkable before the siege. Horses were slaughtered for food, not just draft horses, but the elegant carriage horses of the wealthy, the race horses from the tracks, eventually the horses of the fire brigade. When the horses ran out, people turned to dogs and cats. When those ran out, rats became a delicacy. The cities to elephants, castor, and pollux were butchered and their meat sold at premium prices. Other zoo animals followed camels, yaks, even the beloved animals from the children's gardens. Restaurant menus from December 1870 feature dishes like elephant consomme and roast camel English style. It would be darkly funny if people weren't actually dying of hunger. The poor suffered most, as the poor always do. While the wealthy could afford to buy horse meat at inflated prices, the working-class neighborhoods of Paris saw genuine famine. Infant mortality soared. The elderly and sick died quietly in their apartments. By January, approximately 5,000 Parisians were dying every week, not from German shells, but from hunger, cold, and disease, and yet Paris held on. The government's strategy, such as it was, centered on Leon Gambetta, the fiery young minister who had escaped from besieged Paris in a hot air balloon on October 7th. Gambetta's balloon flight became legendary. He floated over the German lines at dawn, was shot at but not hit, and landed safely in Tours, where he set about organizing a new French resistance. For the next 4 months, Gambetta was the soul of the French war effort, traveling constantly, haranguing officials, and creating armies out of nothing. He raised over 600,000 men, raw recruits, older reserves, anyone who could hold a rifle. He equipped them as best he could, appointed officers of varying competence, and sent them against the German forces occupying northern and western France. The results were predictable. Gambetta's armies were brave but poorly trained, their officers were inexperienced, and they faced the finest military machine in Europe. The Army of the Loire briefly recaptured Orleans in November, raising hopes of relief for Paris, but the Germans counterattacked and drove the French back with heavy losses. Every French offensive failed. The Army of the Loire was shattered. The Army of the North was defeated. The Army of the East, trying to relieve the besieged fortress of Belfort, was pushed back into Switzerland and interned. Wherever French forces met German forces in the open field, the French lost. Inside Paris, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The provisional government launched several sorties, attempting to break through the German lines and link up with Gambetta's armies. The Great Sortie of late November was the most ambitious coordinated attack by nearly 100,000 men, timed to coincide with the Army of the Loire's advance. It failed completely. The Parisian forces captured a few villages, but couldn't hold them. The Army of the Loire never arrived. Thousands of National Guards died in confused fighting against entrenched German positions. The morale of the garrison, already strained, began to crack. And then, on October 27th, came the news that destroyed what remained of French hope. Bazaine had surrendered Metz, the 180,000 soldiers who had been trapped in the fortress since August. The largest intact French field army had laid down their arms after a siege of 70 days. They surrendered not because the walls had been breached, not because they had run out of ammunition, but because they had run out of food. Bazaine was later court-martialed and sentenced to death for his conduct, though the sentence was commuted to 20 years imprisonment. He escaped from his island prison and spent the rest of his life in Spain, despised by his countrymen as the man who had handed France's army to the enemy. The surrender of Metz freed approximately 200,000 German soldiers who had been maintaining the siege. These troops were now available to crush Gambetta's improvised armies and reinforce the siege of Paris. Whatever slim chance France had of reversing the military situation evaporated. By January 1871, the end was near. Paris was starving. The provincial armies had been defeated. The Germans began bombarding the city with heavy siege artillery, adding terror to hunger. Shells crashed into residential neighborhoods, killing civilians in their homes. On January 28, 1871, 4 months and 9 days after the siege began, Paris surrendered. An armistice was declared. France agreed to hold elections for a new National Assembly that would have the authority to negotiate peace. The war was over. France had lost, but before the peace treaty was signed, Bismarck had one final humiliation to deliver. The proclamation of the German Empire on January 18, 1871, was carefully staged for maximum symbolic impact. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles was the most magnificent room in the most magnificent palace in Europe. It had been built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, at the height of French power. Its 17 mirrored arches reflected the light of hundreds of candles. Its ceiling paintings depicted French military victories. Its very existence was a monument to French glory. And now, with Paris still under siege, with French soldiers still dying from hunger and German shells, the German princes gathered in this French Holy of Holies to proclaim their Prussian king as Kaiser of a united Germany. The ceremony was not without its tensions. King Wilhelm I was actually reluctant to become Kaiser. He had wanted to be Kaiser of Germany, which would imply sovereignty over the German princes. Instead, at the insistence of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, he was proclaimed German Kaiser, a more ambiguous title that suggested first among equals rather than absolute supremacy. When Bismarck read out the proclamation, he deliberately obscured the exact title, speaking quickly and quietly. Wilhelm was visibly annoyed. As he descended from the dais, he ignored Bismarck entirely and walked past him without a word. But these were internal German quarrels. To the outside world, and especially to France, the message was clear. Germany had been born in the heart of France, surrounded by symbols of French greatness. While Frenchmen starved outside the gates, the insult was indelible. The new German Empire encompassed 25 states with a combined population of over 40 million people. It stretched from the Rhine to the Russian border, from the Baltic Sea to the Alps. It was the most powerful nation on the European continent, more populous than France, more industrialized than Austria, more militarily formidable than Russia. And it had been created by defeating France. The peace terms, finalized in the Treaty of Frankfurt in May 1871, were brutal. France was forced to cede Alsace and most of Lorraine to Germany, approximately 5,600 square miles of territory containing over 1.5 million people. The city of Strasbourg, with its great Gothic cathedral, became German. The fortress of Metz, where Bazaine's army had surrendered, became German. The iron ore deposits of Lorraine, vital for industrial development, became German. France was required to pay an indemnity of 5 billion gold francs, an astronomical sum equivalent to roughly $200 billion today. The payment schedule was punishing, and German troops would remain on French soil until the debt was paid. As a further humiliation, the Germans staged a victory parade through Paris before withdrawing. The territorial losses were devastating enough, but the indemnity was designed to cripple France for a generation. Bismarck calculated that France would take years, perhaps decades, to pay off the debt, keeping the country weak and occupied during that time. He underestimated French determination. The French government floated to massive bond issues, and the French public, burning with patriotic fervor and humiliation, subscribed enthusiastically. The indemnity was paid off by September 1873, over 2 years ahead of schedule. The last German soldier left French soil that month, but the territories were gone forever, or so it seemed. The immediate aftermath of the war brought one final tragedy, one that killed more Frenchmen than all the battles of the Franco-Prussian War combined. When the armistice was signed and the National Assembly met at Bordeaux, France was split between those who wanted to accept the peace terms and those who wanted to fight on. The Assembly, dominated by conservative rural representatives, voted for peace. Paris, radical and proud, voted for continued resistance. The new head of government was Adolphe Thiers, a veteran politician who understood that France had no choice but to accept German terms. He moved the government to Versailles, yes, the same Versailles where the Germans had proclaimed their empire and prepared to restore order. Paris refused to accept this outcome. The National Guard, which had defended the city during the siege, was overwhelmingly composed of working-class radicals who blamed the government for the defeat. When Thiers sent regular army troops to seize National Guard cannons on March 18, 1871, the population rose in revolt. The Paris Commune was proclaimed a revolutionary government that drew inspiration from the French Revolution of 1789 and anticipated the socialist movements of the 20th century. For 2 months, the Commune ruled Paris, implementing radical reforms and defying the national government. The German army, still occupying northern France, watched with bemused interest. Bismarck offered to release French prisoners of war to help suppress the rebellion. The French, humiliated beyond endurance, accepted. In May 1871, Thiers sent regular army forces into Paris. What followed was Bloody Week. La Semaine Sanglante, 7 days of urban warfare and mass executions that killed somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Parisians. The communards executed hostages, including the Archbishop of Paris. The government troops executed prisoners by the thousands. The streets of Paris ran with blood. By the time the killing stopped, more Frenchmen had died in the suppression of the Commune than in the entire Franco-Prussian War. The working-class neighborhoods of Paris were devastated. Père Lachaise cemetery, where the last communards were executed against a wall that still stands, became a shrine to revolutionary martyrdom. France, having been humiliated by Germany, had turned on itself in an orgy of fratricidal violence. The wounds of 1871 would take generations to heal if they ever did. The Franco-Prussian War was over. In less than 10 months, the map of Europe had been redrawn. France, which had considered itself the dominant power on the continent for 2 centuries, had been crushed in weeks. Germany, which had been a patchwork of squabbling states, had become a unified empire and the strongest military power in Europe. The human cost was significant, but not, by the standards of later wars, catastrophic. Perhaps 150,000 French soldiers died, along with 45,000 Germans. The siege of Paris killed thousands more through starvation and disease. The Commune killed tens of thousands in its brief, bloody existence. But the political cost that would be paid in the 20th century was incalculable. France would never forget. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine became a national obsession, a wound that refused to heal. French school children were taught to remember the lost provinces. Maps showed Alsace-Lorraine in black, as if in mourning. The statue representing Strasbourg in the Place de la Concorde was draped in black cloth. "Never speak of it" became the unofficial motto. Never forget it. Germany, meanwhile, was drunk on victory. The ease of the triumph convinced German military thinkers that they had discovered the secret of modern warfare: rapid mobilization, decisive battle, total victory in weeks. The lessons of 1870 would shape German strategy for the next 70 years, with catastrophic consequences. And Bismarck, the architect of it all, understood that he had created a monster he might not be able to control. Otto von Bismarck had achieved everything he wanted. Germany was unified, France was humiliated. Prussia dominated Europe. The Iron Chancellor stood at the pinnacle of his power, the most feared and respected statesman on the continent, and he was terrified. Bismarck understood, with the clarity of genius, that he had created an unstable situation. Germany's rise had come at France's expense. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine had made permanent reconciliation impossible. France would seek revenge not immediately, perhaps not for decades, but inevitably, a wounded France would look for allies. And therein lay the nightmare that would haunt Bismarck for the next 20 years, the nightmare of coalitions. Germany was strong, but Germany was not invincible. If France allied with Russia, Germany would face 2 front war enemies to the east and west simultaneously. If Austria or Britain joined such an alliance, Germany would be overwhelmed. The very success that had created the German Empire had also created the conditions for its potential destruction. Bismarck's solution was diplomacy of extraordinary complexity. He would keep France isolated. He would keep the other great powers friendly, or at least neutral. He would spin a web of alliances and agreements so intricate that no coalition against Germany could form. The Three Emperors League of 1873 brought Germany together with Austria, Hungary, and Russia, an alliance of the 3 conservative monarchies against the threat of revolution and republicanism. The dual alliance of 1879 bound Germany and Austria-Hungary in a defensive pact against Russia. The Triple Alliance of 1882 added Italy to the German-Austrian partnership. The Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 secretly committed Germany and Russia to neutrality if either was attacked by a third power. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic juggling, and Bismarck was the only man who could keep all the balls in the air. He played the powers against each other, exploited their rivalries, and ensured that France remained without friends. But Bismarck would not live forever. and the system he created was too complex, too dependent on his personal genius to survive without him. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm I died at the age of 90. His son, Frederick III, was already dying of throat cancer and survived his father by only 99 days. The throne passed to Frederick's son, Wilhelm II, a young man of 29 with enormous ambitions and limited judgment. Wilhelm II was everything Bismarck was not. Where Bismarck was patient, Wilhelm was impetuous. Where Bismarck calculated, Wilhelm postured. Where Bismarck understood the limits of German power, Wilhelm believed that German power had no limits. The relationship between the old chancellor and the young Kaiser deteriorated rapidly. Wilhelm wanted to rule, not merely reign. He resented Bismarck's dominance, his paternalistic manner, his habit of treating the emperor like a student in need of instruction. In March 1890, Wilhelm forced Bismarck to resign. The famous Punch cartoon showed Bismarck descending from the ship of state while Wilhelm watched from the deck. The caption read, "Dropping the pilot." It was an APT metaphor. Germany was about to sail into very dangerous waters without the one man who knew how to navigate them. Wilhelm's first major decision was to let the reinsurance treaty with Russia lapse. He considered it too complicated, too contradictory with Germany's other commitments. Besides, why did Germany need to court Russia? Germany was strong enough to stand alone. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Russians, finding themselves without a German alliance, looked elsewhere for security. And the only major power willing to ally with Russia was France. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 was Bismarck's nightmare made real. The two powers that Germany most feared, France to the west, Russia to the east, had joined forces. In any future war, Germany would face exactly the two-front scenario that Bismarck had spent decades trying to prevent. The alliance was a diplomatic revolution. Republican France, heir to the Revolution of 1789, allied with autocratic Russia, the most reactionary regime in Europe. They had nothing in common ideologically. What they had in common was Germany. France provided Russia with loans to build railways and modernize its economy. Russia provided France with the promise of military support if Germany attacked. Both nations began coordinating their military planning, ensuring that Germany would face simultaneous offensives if war came. The isolation that Bismarck had imposed on France was over. The coalition he had feared was forming. And Wilhelm II, blithely confident in German strength, seemed not to notice or not to care. The next 2 decades saw Europe divide into armed camps, each alliance system growing more rigid, each military plan becoming more inflexible. On one side stood the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other stood what would become the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and eventually Britain. Britain's entry into the French orbit was, in many ways, Wilhelm II's greatest blunder. For most of the 19th century, Britain and France had been rivals, competitors for colonial territory, suspicious of each other's intentions. Germany and Britain, by contrast, had been friendly connected by royal marriages, Protestant faith, and commercial ties. But Wilhelm, obsessed with matching British power, embarked on a massive naval building program. German battleships, he believed, would give Germany the respect it deserved on the world stage. Germany would have a fleet to rival Britain's Royal Navy. The British did not see this as a bid for respect. They saw it as a threat. Britain's security depended on naval supremacy. If Germany built a fleet capable of challenging the Royal Navy, Britain's entire strategic position would be undermined. The naval race between Germany and Britain transformed a potential friendship into an existential rivalry. Britain began its own building program, determined to maintain superiority. The cost was enormous. Both nations poured billions into ships that would be obsolete within decades. But the political cost was higher. Britain abandoned its traditional isolation and drew closer to France and Russia. The Entente Cordiale of 1904 resolved colonial disputes between Britain and France. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 did the same for Britain and Russia. By 1907, Europe was divided into two armed camps, each bound by treaty obligations, each preparing for a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. The military planning on both sides made war more likely and, once started, almost impossible to stop. The German General Staff, haunted by the nightmare of the two-front war, developed what became known as the Schlieffen Plan, named after Count Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff from 1891 to 1906. The plan called for a massive offensive against France through Belgium, designed to knock France out of the war in 6 weeks before Russia could fully mobilize. The logic was brutal but clear. Russia was huge and slow to mobilize. German planners estimated it would take 6 to 8 weeks for the Russian army to reach full strength. Germany would use that window to concentrate almost everything against France, deliver a knockout blow, and then shift forces east to deal with Russia. The Schlieffen Plan required precise timing and perfect execution. It also required violating Belgian neutrality, which had been guaranteed by treaty since 1839, a treaty that Germany had signed. When war came, German troops would march through Belgium regardless of treaties, regardless of the diplomatic consequences. The French, for their part, developed Plan 17, an all-out offensive into Lorraine, designed to recover the lost provinces and carry the war into Germany. It was based on faith in the offensive spirit, in élan, in the belief that French courage would overcome German firepower. It was also based on almost complete ignorance of what modern weapons could do to soldiers attacking in the open. Both plans were recipes for catastrophe. Both would fail spectacularly when tested against reality. But in the decades before 1914, they gave military planners the illusion that a future war could be short, decisive, and victorious, just like the Franco-Prussian War had been. The ghost of 1870 haunted every general staff in Europe. Everyone remembered how quickly France had collapsed, how Sedan had ended the war in weeks, how Prussia had marched triumphantly through Paris. Everyone assumed the next war would be similar, a brief, violent clash followed by a decisive peace. They could not have been more wrong. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, lit the fuse that Bismarck had spent his career trying to extinguish. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and issued an ultimatum designed to be rejected. Serbia's response was conciliatory but not completely compliant. Austria declared war on July 28th. Russia, Serbia's protector and ally, began mobilizing its massive army. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria, demanded that Russia stand down. Russia refused. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. The Schlieffen Plan now took over. German mobilization meant attacking France through Belgium. There was no other plan, no alternative strategy. The generals had spent decades perfecting one approach, and they could not deviate from it without total chaos. Germany declared war on France on August 3rd and invaded Belgium the next day. Britain, committed by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany on August 4th. In 6 days, what had begun as an Austro-Serbian dispute had become a general European war. The alliance systems that had been designed to prevent war had instead guaranteed that any conflict would become a continental catastrophe. The military plans that were supposed to ensure quick victory had instead created a conflict that would last for years and kill millions. And at the heart of it all, driving French determination, fueling French willingness to fight, was the memory of 1870. France went to war in 1914 with one overwhelming objective: to recover Alsace-Lorraine. 43 years of humiliation had not dimmed the memory. The statue of Strasbourg was still draped in black. The lost provinces were still marked in mourning on every French map. Revenge had become the organizing principle of French nationalism. When war came, France mobilized with an enthusiasm that surprised even French leaders. The nation that had been divided by the Dreyfus Affair, by conflicts between church and state, by class warfare and political instability, suddenly united around a single purpose: to defeat Germany and reclaim what had been stolen. The French army marched into Lorraine in August 1914, their red trousers and blue coats making perfect targets against the summer landscape. They believed in the offensive spirit, in the bayonet, in the irresistible elan of French soldiers. They ran directly into German machine guns. The Battle of the Frontiers killed over 300,000 French soldiers in the first month of the war. It was the bloodiest month in French military history. Plan the 17th was a complete failure. The recovered provinces remained German. But France did not collapse. Unlike 1870, there was no Sedan, no encirclement, no captured emperor. The French army retreated, regrouped, and counterattacked at the Marne. The German advance was halted. The Schlieffen Plan failed. What followed was not the quick, decisive war that everyone had expected. It was for years of trench warfare, industrial slaughter, and mutual exhaustion. The weapons that had seemed so effective in 1870, artillery, railroads, rifles, had become exponentially more deadly, but tactics had not kept pace. The result was stalemate, a continuous front stretching from Switzerland to the English Channel, where millions of men lived and died in conditions of indescribable horror. The Franco-Prussian War had lasted 10 months and killed perhaps 200,000 soldiers. World War I lasted 4 years and killed over 17 million people. The quick war that 1870 had promised was a lie. The reality was Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele names that would become synonyms for pointless mass death. Germany lost World War I. The treaty that ended the conflict was signed at Versailles in the same Hall of Mirrors where the German Empire had been proclaimed 48 years earlier. The symbolism was deliberate. France had waited nearly half a century for revenge, and now revenge was served. The treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, exactly 48 years and 4 months after the proclamation of the German Empire. The terms were harsh. Germany lost territory on all sides. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France, of course, but also territory to Belgium, Denmark, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The German army was limited to 100,000 men. The German navy was surrendered. Germany was required to pay massive reparations, debts that would cripple the German economy for years. And Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war, the famous war guilt clause that Germans found humiliating beyond measure. The Treaty of Versailles was designed to ensure that Germany could never again threaten France. It succeeded, briefly, but it also created the conditions for something far worse. The humiliation of Versailles became the obsession of German nationalism in the 1920s and 1930s. The stab in the back myth, the lie that Germany had been betrayed by socialists and Jews rather than defeated on the battlefield, became an article of faith for millions of Germans. Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, to restore German greatness, to avenge the humiliation of 1918. The wounds of 1870 had created the desire for French revenge. The wounds of 1918 created the desire for German revenge. Each humiliation demanded repayment. Each repayment created new grievances. In 1940, when Germany conquered France in 6 weeks, achieving what it had failed to achieve in 4 years of World War I, Hitler staged the French surrender in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed the armistice in 1918. The symbolism was deliberate, the humiliation intentional. France, which had humiliated Germany at Versailles, was now humiliated in turn. And when World War II finally ended, when Germany was divided and occupied, when the full horror of the Nazi regime was revealed, the cycle of revenge finally began to break. The Franco-German relationship after 1945 became one of the great success stories of modern history. The two nations that had fought three catastrophic wars in 70 years 1870, 1914, 1939 somehow found a way to reconcile. The European coal and steel community of 1951 integrated the industries that had fueled their wars. The Treaty of Rome in 1957 created the European Economic Community. The LEC Treaty of 1963 formalized Franco-German friendship. Slowly, painfully, over decades, the enemies became partners. Alsace-Lorraine is French today, and no one seriously disputes it. The border that was worth hundreds of thousands of lives is now an administrative line that most people cross without noticing. The hatred that seemed eternal has faded into history. French and German children study together, work together, marry each other without the burden of ancestral grievance. It is, perhaps, the most hopeful lesson of this entire story. The cycles of revenge can be broken. The wounds of history can heal. Nations that seemed destined for eternal enmity can become friends. But the cost of learning that lesson was almost incomprehensible. 2 world wars, tens of millions of dead, the Holocaust. The near destruction of European civilization. All of it flowing, in ways direct and indirect, from that ceremony in the Hall of Mirrors in January 1871. What does the Franco-Prussian War teach us? It teaches us that quick victories can plant the seeds of long catastrophes. Bismarck won the war in weeks, but the peace he imposed lasted only decades before collapsing into a far greater conflict. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine seemed like a reasonable prize in 1871. It became the cancer that poisoned European diplomacy for generations. It teaches us that humiliation is not strategy. Proclaiming the German Empire at Versailles was a gesture of contempt that accomplished nothing except to deepen French hatred. The war could have been won just as thoroughly without that insult. But Bismarck, or perhaps Wilhelm I, or perhaps the generals couldn't resist the temptation to grind French faces in their defeat. It teaches us that military success can create dangerous illusions. The Franco-Prussian War convinced an entire generation of military planners that wars could be short and decisive, that proper planning and aggressive tactics would produce quick victories. Those illusions led directly to the slaughter of 1914 to 1918, when reality proved far more terrible than anyone had imagined. It teaches us that the systems we create to preserve peace can instead guarantee war. Bismarck's alliance system was designed to prevent coalitions from forming against Germany. After he left, that system ossified into the rigid blocks that made World War I inevitable once any spark occurred. And it teaches us that history does not end. The Franco-Prussian War was not the end of Franco-German conflict. It was the beginning of a cycle that would last 75 years. Each war created the conditions for the next. Each peace contained the seeds of future violence. Only the unprecedented catastrophe of World War II and the conscious decision to break the cycle finally brought the pattern to an end. There is a photograph from 1984 that captures something profound about the legacy of the Franco-Prussian War and everything that followed. French President François Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl are standing together at Verdun, the site of the longest and most devastating battle of World War I. They are holding hands. Their heads are bowed. Behind them stand the graves of hundreds of thousands of French and German soldiers who killed each other in 1916. The gesture was spontaneous, or at least appeared spontaneous. Two men whose nations had been enemies for a century, standing in a place where their grandfathers' generation had slaughtered each other by the millions, joined in a moment of shared mourning and reconciliation. That image would have been unthinkable in 1871. It would have been unthinkable in 1918. It would have been unthinkable in 1945. But by 1984, it had become possible, even natural. The Franco-Prussian War created modern Germany in an act of blood and iron. It humiliated France in a way that demanded revenge. It set in motion a chain of events that would kill tens of millions and reshape the world.